Amen. Hey, good morning. Hey, welcome to Christ Church. Happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Sunday. I am thrilled that you all are here this morning to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ with us this morning. If you are new, let me say welcome. This morning, what better way to celebrate Jesus, to celebrate what he did for us on the cross, than to recognize and identify how he has transformed our own lives. How his life, his love, and his word has transformed us from a life of sin and death to a life of redemption and salvation. And so let me ask you for a second, how has Jesus transformed your life? 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17 says this, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here." Man, how great is that? Do you recognize that your old life, your life of sin is gone or can be gone, and a new life can be because of Jesus Christ? Today, it's our prayer that you have a moment to be able to process, to be able to recognize transformation that has taken place in your life because of Jesus. Over the last several weeks, as a church, we've been diving through the book of John, specifically looking at people who have had a face-to-face interaction with Jesus. In doing so, to build up to today, to build up to look at how Jesus transformed Peter's life. We're going to be looking at this transformation that can only come because of what Jesus did on the cross. You see, everybody who has lived before us, and us now, and then everyone who will live after us, all of us, we have fallen short. All of us have rejected God, rejected our Creator. And we've all received this death sentence. And because of that, there's nothing that we can do to change our situation. There's nothing that we can do to repair or rebuild our relationship with God. And because of that, something drastic, something radical had to be done on our behalf. And Jesus, he did that on the cross. The perfect Son of God. You see, he was born a human baby. He lived a sinless life, even though he was faced with the same temptation that you and I face. And here's what's great about Jesus. He didn't have to, but he went ahead and he took on our punishment. He took on my punishment. He took on your punishment on the cross. And it's because of that great sacrifice that he made that we can be transformed. Today we're going to be starting in the book of John, chapter 18. So if you got your Bibles, that's where we're going to hang out. We're actually going to go through John 18 through 21. Andrew and I are going to tag team this today, a little bit different than normal. But if you recall, I believe it was last week, we looked at this face-to-face encounter of a man named Lazarus, and Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. That event would have happened 2 weeks before John 18 was recorded. Now, just hours before what we read in John 18, Jesus, he takes the disciples into the upper room in Jerusalem. They've already entered in Jerusalem for Passover, that triumphal entry, and now he enters into the upper room and they celebrate Passover, the Last Supper. And then after that meal, Jesus takes the disciples up to the Mount of Olives to pray, and that's where John 18 begins. So let's start in verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was a garden, and he and the disciples went into it. I love the details that the book of John gives us. Throughout John, and especially today, we're going to see some details that none of the other gospel writers throw in there. The fact that John includes the Kidron Valley here is huge. You see, the Kidron Valley, it plays a major role throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament times, anything associated with the Kidron Valley came with sorrow or darkness or death even. When they had destroyed the idols or the temples or anything that had to do with idolatry, they would throw those remains into the Kidron Valley. The priest, anything that came unholy, the priest would take from the Holy of Holies or the Temple Mount, and they would dump it into the Kidron Valley. The Kidron Valley essentially became Jerusalem's city dump. If you remember King David fled through the Kidron Valley and beyond as he was running from his own son Absalom, as Absalom was trying to kill him and trying to take his throne. This is the same valley that many believe David was referring to in Psalms 23. You remember the psalm? Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. This valley, it's just outside of Jerusalem. And on the other side of the valley is the Mount of Olives. And so this is the night that John is describing here. As Jesus' disciples, they go through the Kidron Valley and they go up to the Mount of Olives. But there's a difference between David here. You see, David, he fled through it and he kept on going, running away from his opposition. Jesus is going to go through the Kidron Valley, but he's going to stop at the Mount of Olives, and he's going to turn and he's going to face his enemies in order to save the world. Verse 2. Now Judas, who betrayed him, he knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden. He's guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They're carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So paint this picture in your head. Jesus, he decides to go back to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane, because he knows Judas is familiar with this place. He knows that Judas is coming to betray him. In fact, he told Judas that at the Last Supper. And here we go. Judas, he comes up. He goes through the Kidron Valley himself. He comes up to the Mount of Olives, and he gets into the olive orchard. And he's not alone, though. What did it say there? It says he was guiding a detachment of soldiers. If you were to break down that word detachment in the original Greek language, it was referring to 600 Roman soldiers. Remember who Rome was. They conquered the known world at the time. So this is 600 men who were trained to kill, trained for combat, trained to fight, and he's leading them along with, it says, some officials. They were officials from the high priest, so these would have been temple guards who were also trained to protect, trained to fight, and some Pharisees. And they're armed to fight. They've got weapons, but it says it's night, so they got lanterns, they got torches, and I'm sure Jesus sees them coming up the hill. Why do you think they needed so many men? If you remember back to John chapter 7. John chapter 7 says the Pharisees tried to arrest Jesus using temple guards. I don't know if they're the same temple guards here, but in John chapter 7 it says they weren't even able to touch Jesus. And he was able to go. And so the Pharisees this time, they're serious. And they're using everything within their arsenal to go and to arrest Jesus. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, he went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and they fell to the ground. Picture this for a second. They drew back and they fell to the ground. There's 600 plus Roman soldiers and their entourage. And Jesus simply speaks the words, "I am he." And it says they fell back and they fell to the ground. They fell to the ground, the Roman army, simply by Jesus uttering the words, "I am he." I am. Does that remind you of the words that God speaks to Moses at the burning bush? You see, Jesus here, he's declaring who he is. He is the Messiah. He is the Christ. He's the Son of God. He is God in the flesh, and he's demonstrating his power. He's demonstrating his authority by simply speaking. You see, Jesus is in total control of everything that happened up to this point. But here's the awesome thing. He is in total control of everything that's going to happen after this point. And so, yes, he is declaring who he is, but at the same time, he's going to submit himself and allow himself to be arrested, beaten, and eventually crucified. Jump down to verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, he drew it, and he struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" So Peter here, he's ready to throw down. He's ready for a fight. And keep in mind, Peter knows exactly who Jesus was. He just spent the last 3 years of his life with Jesus, experiencing Jesus, watching him perform miracle after miracle. And whether that was when he saw Jesus heal his own mother-in-law, or when Jesus literally took a few pieces of bread and a few fish to feed thousands. He saw Jesus have command over nature as he calmed storms. And even in some of that, he saw Jesus walk on the storms and was able to experience that himself. He saw Jesus heal the sick, give sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf. He saw Jesus have complete authority over demons as he cast them out. And Peter himself was even given that same authority to heal the sick and to cast out demons. He saw Jesus raise people from the dead. Peter was the first of 12 disciples to publicly state that Jesus, you are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. So Peter, he's here and he's ready to fight for Jesus. He's ready to give his life for him. And he draws his sword, and I believe he was trying to kill Malchus. But Malchus, thankfully for his sake, he was able to duck quicker than Peter. And he only loses an ear rather than his head. The problem was, Peter thought that Jesus was there to restore Israel for an earthly kingdom, rather than to restore humanity for an eternal kingdom. And Jesus demonstrates that fact that he was there to restore all by picking up Malchus's ear and replacing it on his head like nothing had happened. Verse 12. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him, and they brought him first to Ananias, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Verse 15, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's court. But Peter, he had to wait outside the door. The other disciple was known to the high priest and came back and spoke to the servant girl on duty there and brought Peter in. You aren't one of the men's disciples too, are you? She asked Peter. He replied, I am not. It was cold, and the servants and the officials, they stood around the fire they had made to keep warm. And so Peter, he goes, and he also stands around the fire warming himself. So Peter, and it says another disciple, were following Jesus. It's believed that other disciple is actually John, the author of this book. You see, generally when John referred to himself in this book, he never called himself John. It was generally the disciple whom Jesus loved. In this case, I believe it was the other disciple. And so John gives us some details about this servant girl that we didn't know. John, apparently, he had a relationship with the high priest and maybe even with this girl. And so he gets permission to bring Peter in. And so I would think if this girl knows who John is, surely she knows that John is a disciple of Jesus. And if she knows John is a disciple of Jesus, pretty she could put two and two together and think, well, Peter is a disciple of Jesus too. And so what does Peter have to lose here by saying, yeah, I'm a disciple of Jesus? But Peter doesn't do that. He, instead of speaking the truth, Peter denies Jesus now for the first time. And so we're going to jump down to verse 25, and here again, Peter's still standing outside this open fire. And there's high priest servants, and there's other officials there, and they're standing there too. And I imagine Peter's doing everything he can to see what they're doing to Jesus, maybe to hear what their plan is. And I don't know, if you know the character of Peter, maybe he's trying to figure out, how am I going to rescue Jesus? How am I going to get him out of this situation? And verse 25 says, meanwhile, Simon Peter, he's still standing there warming himself. So they ask him, aren't you one of his disciples too? He denied it, saying, I am not. This is Peter's second denial. John records in chapter 13, during the Last Supper, that Peter claims to Jesus. He declares, I will lay down my life for you. The gospel writer of Luke, he records the same scenario, and in that case, he records Peter saying, Lord, I am ready to go to you, to prison and to death. Verse 26. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenges him. Didn't I see you with him in the garden? Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment, the rooster began to crow. This is the third denial of Peter. And this takes place about an hour after the second denial, Luke tells us. And so I don't know, maybe in that hour, Peter began to relax. Maybe he thought no one else would bother him. Maybe he thought his lies had worked. But now, as the dawn is about to rise and those earliest rays of dawn, they break through the sky. Now comes this third man and says, didn't I see you with him in the garden? John gives us this added information that this third man, he was a relative of Malchus, that had lost his ear earlier tonight. I'm sure he remembered Peter. And he was there, based off his questioning, at the garden. And Luke records Peter saying, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Peter was getting frustrated. Verse 27, and that moment the rooster began to crow. Here's what Luke's gospel records right after that happened. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Man, could you imagine the sound of hearing that rooster crow? It must have been terrifying and heartbreaking. Everything that needed to be said was in Jesus' eyes. All that Peter needed to understand was transferred in this look. Peter, he's got to be feeling ashamed. He's feeling regret. He must be thinking, man, what if I had just responded with the truth? What if I had told that servant girl, those men who recognized me, the truth? What if I had taken a moment and just acknowledged that, you know what? Yeah, I was in the garden. In fact, I'm the one that attacked Malchus. If Peter had been honest in those earlier encounters, maybe he could have avoided this final look from Jesus. I imagine that as Peter's eyes locked onto Jesus' eyes, as that connection took place, Peter, he's feeling the full weight of what he had done now. He would have felt like an imposter or a traitor even, as he was defeated by his own denial. And I believe that there's a word that kept going in and out of Peter's mind of what he had just done, and now he's been called out on it, of how he viewed himself. Peter now was thinking that he was a failure, that he had failed the Son of God, that he had failed Jesus. After all he experienced and all that he's seen, he had failed him. Now, despite what emotions Peter may have been going through or what self-image he was experiencing, I would imagine, though, that the eyes of Jesus, he saw none of those things. I would imagine, actually, I'm pretty confident that he did not see condemnation from Jesus' eyes. Instead, I believe he saw love. He saw hope. He saw compassion for one of his lost ones. Because remember, what does Jesus go on to do for Peter? What does he go on to do for you and I? Jesus, after this, he submits himself to complete human control. He allows himself to be mocked, allows himself to be beaten, to be tried, and even hung on a cross to death. Jesus, he gives his life for Peter, and he gave his life for every human ever born. Why? Because God loves us that much. This morning, if you have your communion, take it out. I'd like to take a moment to remember what Jesus did for us that day on the cross, so that we can embrace that hope that only he can give. I'd like for us to do that in the same manner that Jesus himself modeled for us the Last Supper. So take your communion out, and let me read Luke chapter 22, verse 19. And he took bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Go ahead and take that now. Verse 20, in the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood, which is poured out for you. Do this in remembrance of me."
Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. She came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, and the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over, and he looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed.
The grave could not hold him. Death was conquered once and for all. And the new covenant has been forged at the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's why we celebrate today. And maybe you came because you believe Jesus, you believe things about Jesus, but maybe you don't know what it looks like or what to do with a resurrected Jesus. How to respond to a resurrected Jesus. And I think that's what we find in John 21, is the disciples are going to encounter Jesus. In John 21, in verse 2, it starts like this: Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Now notice that Peter and the other disciples have returned from Jerusalem. They've experienced the resurrected Jesus 2 times at this point. And yet they go back to their hometown. They go back to their old life. They go back to their old jobs and living a life that they're not called to. They go out and they go fishing because they're living in an identity that's rooted in failure. And so they go out and they do that. Their past, their failures, are what they're living in. See, they have faith. They have faith that Jesus has risen from the grave. They've seen him. They've talked to him. They've touched him. But they're not living a life of faith. John 21, verse 4, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Now, like I said, the disciples had gone back to their old identity, their old jobs. If you remember, where does Jesus find them? He finds them on the Sea of Galilee, fishing, when he makes the first call to them. I also find it interesting, in that first call, they were professional fishermen and had not caught any fish all night long. And here again, we have the same scenario. We've went back to what we know, the one thing that we can do, and we can't even do that right. Have you ever had one of those moments in your life where just everything is falling apart, where it's like, man, nothing is working out. Even the things I know how to do are not working the way they ought to work. They kind of knew how to fish. They weren't doing it very well. And when Jesus says, "Throw your nets on the other side," you got to remember these boats are like 7 foot wide. All right? They've been fishing all night. A little act of obedience translates into a great opportunity for God's faithfulness. Don't miss that. Little obedience, little steps of obedience translates into God's glory. And so they take their nets, they throw them in on the other side, and they catch so many fish, it says that they can't even get them in. They can't get them back in the boat because there's so many. It's the recalling of their initiation into a relationship with Jesus. Jesus is providing for them both in their past, when he first found them, and he's providing for them in their failures right now. He is faithful even whenever we are faithless. And he's preparing and inviting them into a relationship, to share a meal with him, and to experience his goodness. In verse 10, Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat, dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, gave it to them, did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. And so the disciples are reminded of who Jesus is, the Lord. That 153 is a very specific number that's found and recorded for us by John. Remember, numbers and words, especially for the Hebrews, were a big deal. That 153 number translates into I am God in the Hebrew, which is kind of crazy. Because it wasn't 146 fish, it wasn't 155 fish, it was 153 fish. I am God. It also signifies all the earth. And so when you put these together, the 153 fish, I am God of all of the earth. And what was the call that Jesus originally made to the disciples? Lay down your nets, and I will make you fisher of men. I'm calling you into a new purpose. I'm calling you into a new identity. Don't let your past, your failures, determine your identity. God is saying through Jesus, I determine your identity. I determine the future. And so, in doing so, in this declaration, Jesus is reminding them of who he is and what the calling is, and he's fulfilling a prophecy that Ezekiel, the prophet, had shared about the coming of the Messiah and what he would do. In Ezekiel 47:8, Ezekiel records this: this water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into Arabah, where it enters the Dead Sea. When it empties into the sea, the salty water becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There will be large number of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-gedi to En-eglaim. There will be places for spreading nets. The fish will be many kinds, like the fish of the Mediterranean Sea. Do you remember what Jesus said to the woman at the well? He says, I am the living water. And what he said to Lazarus, what we discussed last week, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is declaring here, I am God of all nations, and where the living water flows, there will be life. No matter what you've done, no matter your past, no matter what your present situation may be, it may feel like salt water in a wound that's just burning and good for nothing. I bring living water. I bring new life into the situation. Jesus is declaring he has the final word because he has conquered all things. In John 21:15, we see this. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And I don't know what Jesus is referring to necessarily here more than these. Maybe it's the boats, the nets, the life. But he's saying, do you love me more than all of these things? Of your situation, of your past, of your present. Do you love me? And Peter replies, you know I love you. And Jesus says, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. 3 times denial in the courtyard. I don't know him. Not me. And 3 times Jesus invites him to a restored relationship. He's cut to the heart not because Jesus is condemning him, but he knows he's being called back into a relationship with him. He's saying, you, Peter, you may feel disqualified because of your failures, but I'm calling you back into the mission. He's like, let's stand up, let's go together. I have a job for you, Peter, and I've called you. I know what you've done, and I've accomplished what you couldn't. And what Jesus does is only what he can do. He invites us into a relationship. See, he takes their failures and he has a final word for those who trust him. And as they're sitting there, Jesus tells Peter what's going to happen to him, that he is going to suffer, that he is going to die for the sake of Christ. But he gives him an invitation to follow. He says, "Follow me." Very similar to that very first calling. The difference is, this time Peter understands. It's not about what Peter can do to make God happy. It's about what Jesus has done on his behalf. Because he declares Peter forgiven. And in his forgiveness, God provides a future for Peter. This morning, you should have one of these little tags on your seat. And I would just invite you to write that phrase, a word that might describe what God has done in your life. From death to life, from lost to found, from broken to redeemed. See, what Peter and the other disciples now understand, it's not about them, it's about Jesus. That he becomes the Lord of their past, their present, and future. That our failures are wiped as far as the east is from the west. And he invites us, he calls us into a relationship with him. In Acts chapter 2, Peter is standing on the steps of the temple. And from those steps, you can look directly, about 200 yards away, is the courtyard of the high priest's house. The same spot that he denied Jesus just a few weeks before, he's now standing in Acts chapter 2 proclaiming the gospel message. And we know as a result of that thousands come to know who Jesus is and they submit their lives to baptism. See, Jesus has the final word about our future. And it's the same call, the same question that Jesus asked Peter. Follow me. Will you follow Jesus? That's the question this morning. For me, following Jesus has made me alive.